Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kristen Hopewell from the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. I'd like to welcome you to our event today. We're delighted to have Peter Martin here to discuss his new book, China's Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. This event is hosted by the Center for Chinese Research and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the land on which UBC is situated and on which we're virtually gathering today is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. We're extremely excited to have Peter Martin here to discuss his fascinating and provocative new book. Peter is a journalist for Bloomberg News focused on defense policy and intelligence. He's written extensively on escalating tensions in the US-China relationship and reported from China's border with North Korea, as well as from Xinjiang. In addition to his reporting for Bloomberg, his work has been published in a long list of other impressive outlets, including Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, and The Guardian, to name just a few. We're also very fortunate to have Professor Paul Evans here to act as a discussant and provide some commentary on the book. Professor Evans is the HSBC Chair in Asian Research in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. He's one of Canada's leading authorities on Asia-Pacific security, as well as Canada-China relations, and most recently has contributed extensively to growing debates about the rise of techno-nationalism. He's the author or editor of 7 books and a lengthy list of articles on this topic, and he's also a former director of the Institute of Asian Research and past co-CEO and chair of the Executive Committee of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. So in terms of the format for the event today, first, Peter Martin will give a brief presentation on his book. Then Paul Evans will provide commentary. We'll give Peter a chance to respond before opening up to audience Q&A. So for our audience members, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll turn to those later in our session. So without further ado, I'll now turn it over to Peter.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to join you all virtually, and I hope that in sunnier times in the future we can do this in person. But so I thought I'd kind of discuss how I came to write a book about Chinese diplomats and why that topic for some reason seemed appealing to me, and then to discuss some of the kind of key arguments and the findings, and I think the discussion is going to be particularly fun. It's always the best part of doing book talks. So I guess in terms of why this topic, it really stemmed from my thoughts on moving back to China in early 2017. I'd been away for a few years, living in India and then in Washington, DC, and moved back to Beijing to work for Bloomberg, and was immediately struck, of course, by the massive progress that China had made in terms of its hard power, in terms of its economic growth, which was beating estimates, in terms of the Belt and Road Infrastructure project, which President Xi Jinping was promoting all over the world, and in terms of military progress, the People's Liberation Army was about to launched China's first overseas base in Djibouti and was busy militarizing artificial islands it had built in the South China Sea. And perhaps even more important than that, President Xi's administration seemed to face this extraordinary opportunity created by the diplomacy of the Trump administration, which of course was busy picking fights with US allies from Canada to Mexico and beyond, and was disparaging international organizations. And from Beijing's perspective, this was a real advantage. They even talked about it as something which could extend what they call China's window of strategic opportunity. But the more I kind of watched things unfold from my vantage point in Beijing, the more it seemed that China was actually alienating outside opinion as time went on, and was kind of struggling to step into that leadership role and to persuade others. And when you step back and think about the kind of world that we're moving into, this is going to be a world where US power will slowly wane. where there are going to be multiple centers of power and influence, and where the ability to persuade others is going to command a tremendous premium. And so I started to think, why does China seem to be so incapable of doing that? And started to kind of see Chinese diplomats in particular as a microcosm of that broader struggle to communicate. And when I interacted with them on a personal level, they can be suave, funny, charming. They speak multiple foreign languages. They've spent decades living overseas in the countries to which they're posted. But when they get up on stage in the foreign ministry to deliver press conferences, or when they sit down across the table from their foreign counterparts, they can become quite stilted, rigid, ideological, and in the last few years also increasingly aggressive and even hostile. And so I started to kind of get curious about this, and I was conducting interviews in Beijing, of course, with people on the Chinese side, and with foreign diplomats who had spent their careers interacting with China. But I also wanted to find a kind of body of Chinese language sources if I could, and I came across these memoirs written by former Chinese diplomats, a couple at first, but I quickly found that there were more than 100 of these books, and which kind of detailed the personal experiences on the front lines of Chinese diplomacy, of people who had served in the cultural section in New Zealand, to ambassadors to the United Nations and the United States and so on. And I kind of used that as the source base to pull together the book. And when I started on this project in 2017, this was a pretty niche topic. I was interested because I like geeky foreign policy topics, but I had very, I wasn't particularly bothered about whether what I had to say would resonate beyond my own interests. But as the years kind of rolled on, as I'm sure people listening will know, Chinese diplomats started acting in this way, which has been labeled wolf warrior diplomacy. So there were incidents of Chinese envoys storming out of international meetings, telling foreign interlocutors to shut up, spreading conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID-19, and of course the former Chinese ambassador to Canada, Liu Xiaoye, was one of the most prominent practitioners of that approach. And so as that kind of unfolded, the topic became more and more mainstream, and has now been mentioned by governments around the world as a kind of worrying warning sign of the kind of power that China might become. But I guess what was particularly striking to me, having done a lot of this research and spent so much time with the memoirs, was that while wolf warrior diplomacy seems very new on the surface, the roots of that approach go back a very, very long way. When the People's Republic of China was founded by Chairman Mao in 1949, it had basically no diplomats to speak of. The new government kicked out any of the few nationalist diplomats who had remained behind because it believed that they were too ideologically impure to represent the new regime. And this, the new China was led by this political party, the Communist Party, which had spent most of its existence as an underground organization, constantly worried about threats to its existence from the outside, chased and harried across China. And even when it took power in 49, it was acutely aware of threats that might exist to its ability to rule, from the rival nationalist government on Taiwan to the anti-communist United States in the early years of the Cold War. But alongside that paranoia was also a need to communicate with the outside world and to win friends, to build influence, and perhaps most importantly, to establish the communists as the legitimate ruling body in China. And so to kind of square that circle and meet those two kind of competing imperatives, the PRC's first foreign minister and its first premier, a man called Zhou Enlai, came up with this approach for Chinese diplomacy, where he said that Chinese diplomats should think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. So in other words, they should model their approach to communicating with the world on the fighting force which had propelled the communists to power. And what Zhou meant by that was that Chinese diplomats should be unfailingly loyal to the Communist Party. They should be disciplined to a fault, and they should display what he called a fighting spirit as they protected China's interests. And with that kind of militaristic martial ethos came a bunch of really distinctive behaviors, which were visible in 1949 and many of which still exist today. So Chinese diplomats will typically stick incredibly closely to talking points, even if they know that those talking points don't resonate with the people sitting across the table. They will move around in pairs using a buddy system to keep tabs on each other. They will shout at foreign counterparts when they feel cornered or they are worried about not looking tough enough back home. And they'll elevate even the smallest of perceived slights or insults, sometimes into major international incidents, because they worry that they'll be judged as disloyal if they fail to do so. And so this kind of approach led to displays of what we would now call wolf warrior diplomacy right from the outset. So in 1950, this veteran revolutionary leader called Wu Xiuquan, who had been appointed to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, led a delegation to the United Nations in New York. And he delivered a speech which Time magazine described as 2 awful hours of rasping vituperation. You know, he kind of made today's wolf warriors look like a bunch of wimps. In the 1960s, Chinese diplomats, clashed with protesters and outside the Chinese rep office in London. One of them was pictured wielding an axe in a photograph. They were expelled from countries ranging from Indonesia to Kenya. They handed out copies of Mao's little red books on the streets of foreign capitals. So that kind of instinct toward brash assertiveness has been there for a long time, but it's really important to keep it in the context of another equally important tradition in Chinese diplomacy, which is this drive to winning friends and influencing others and improving China's reputation. At times when the Chinese leadership has made that a priority over ideology at home or political crackdowns, Chinese diplomats have taken that extraordinary discipline that Zhou Enlai required of them, and they've turned it toward winning friends. So in the 1950s, Zhou Enlai led a delegation to the Bandung Conference for Developing Nations and really helped to spearhead an effort to win China friends in non-aligned countries, really expanding its circle of influence outside the communist bloc for the first time. In the 1990s, China embarked on an extraordinarily successful charm offensive across the world and was able to rehabilitate its global image after the Tiananmen massacre. And of course, that effort culminated in Beijing hosting the 2008 Summer Olympics. So I kind of think of there being 2 tendencies in Chinese diplomacy which cycle in and out over time. There's a tendency to charm the world, and there's a tendency to use wolf warrior tactics to tell the world off. And I guess that since 2008, we've seen a pretty decisive lurch back toward that kind of combative, brash wolf warrior approach. And I think that that's been driven by 2 things. I think on the one hand, there's a new confidence on the part of Chinese elites. And on the other, there are these enduring insecurities, which are a product of China's political system, but which have been exacerbated by the policies of President Xi. So the new confidence really dates to that period after the Olympics, but especially as the global financial crisis took place. China's elites looked at the kind of sluggish, slow, sometimes ineffective response of Western political elites to that crisis, and they contrasted it with the ability of their political system to inject a massive and decisive stimulus package into the Chinese economy. And they started to think, you know what, we've been so deferential to the West and the way that it does things, and the model that it upholds, it claims to uphold for so long, but maybe our model has something going for it, and maybe we can stand on our own 2 feet and be confident in our own approach. And that kind of led to a couple of years of quite assertive Chinese diplomacy on the country's periphery in 2009-10. But that assertiveness really became much more clear, consistent, and assertive after 2012, when Xi Jinping became leader of the Communist Party. And under Xi, Chinese politics have become an increasingly tense and even scary place. President Xi has overseen a sweeping anti-corruption campaign, which has seen more than 1.5 million officials punished, and has treated political disloyalty as a form of corruption. He has abolished presidential term limits, potentially setting himself up as leader for life. He's experimented with the use of re-education camps in far western China, in the region of Xinjiang, and he's focused on ideology at home. And frequently his speeches have displayed hostility to outside, and especially to Western influences in China's cultural and especially its political realms. And when Chinese diplomats see these signals, they know exactly how to interpret them. So, the Foreign Ministry over the years has experienced multiple rounds of purges in which colleagues have been encouraged to inform on each other. In the Cultural Revolution, things got so bad that junior Chinese diplomats locked their superiors in cellars. They forced them to clean toilets, and ambassadors and vice ministers were beaten until they coughed up blood. Large numbers of Chinese diplomats were even themselves sent off to re-education camps in the Chinese countryside. And so when Chinese officials and Chinese diplomats watch these changes take place in Chinese politics, they interpret them with a kind of contextual richness that I think we often lack as outsiders. They know exactly how high the stakes can be if you get on the wrong side of the system. And so when they watch President Xi Jinping deliver speeches where he talks about China standing tall in the East, moving closer and closer to the center of the world stage, never tolerating foreign bullying, never giving up an inch of its territory. And of course, the framing idea behind his whole approach to governing China has been this idea of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So when they hear him make these speeches, they feel compelled, partly through fear, partly through ambition, to emulate that approach. And I think that goes a long way to explaining where this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy has come from. And it really went into high gear, of course, after the onset of the coronavirus, when once again, Chinese diplomats felt under attack and they felt insecure because the world was blaming China for the start of the virus. But they also felt this new confidence that I mentioned before, where they felt like their system had handled things much better than the United States or Europe and many other Western countries, and they had something to be proud of, and they didn't need to be pushed around. I think if one diplomat has kind of become emblematic of that new approach, it's Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian, who was a relatively obscure figure posted to China's embassy in Islamabad. He manages to get himself into a Twitter spat with former US National Security Advisor Susan Rice. And this incident kind of rocketed him to fame inside China. And he was rewarded with the post of Foreign Ministry spokesman, something that hadn't been on his career path until that point. But when he arrived back in Beijing, and approached his office in the foreign ministry, he was actually greeted by a small group of young Chinese diplomats who literally applauded his approach in the building. And from that post, he's managed to alienate pretty much everyone who has come across his path. He posted a doctored image on Twitter of an Australian soldier holding a knife to the throat of an Afghan child. And perhaps most provocatively, he suggested that the US Army had deliberately spread COVID-19 in Wuhan, causing consternation in Donald Trump's Oval Office. But Zhao is part of a whole constellation of characters who have taken this approach across the world. Gui Tongyo, who was until recently China's ambassador in Sweden, was summoned by the Swedish Foreign Ministry more than 40 times in the space of 2 years. And when he was asked about his provocative behavior, he said, "For our friends, we have fine wine, and for our enemies, we have shotguns." Which gives you an idea of just how comfortable he is with that kind of combative approach. It's important to stress that not everyone in China's diplomatic establishment likes this new approach. Yuan Nansheng, who was China's former consul general in San Francisco, has warned about a trend toward extreme nationalism in Chinese foreign policy, which he says risks alienating the world. And even President Xi himself talked in a Politburo study session earlier this year about the need for China to cultivate a lovable image in the world, which I think is at least a kind of tacit recognition that China's foreign policy, its external propaganda, and perhaps especially its diplomats have been more frightening than lovable in recent years. But as I said at the outset, anyone who has delved into the history of Chinese diplomacy will know that actually this fighting spirit, this combative assertiveness we've seen recently has very, very deep roots, and in many ways has been part of the DNA of the Chinese Foreign Ministry right from the start. And so maybe with that, I'll pause my remarks and we can get into a discussion. And thank you so much everyone for listening.
Great. Thank you, Peter, for a fascinating discussion of your book. There's lots to engage with here. So we'll turn it over to Paul for some discussant commentary. And I'll just remind our audience members as well, if you have questions, feel free, please, to post them using the Q&A function. Thanks, Paul.
Peter, thank you for being with us today and to open up your book for discussion. Excuse me. Is my voice coming through? Okay. Thank you for opening up your book for a discussion in Canada, where several of us have been reading the book and have found it a very valuable book at this time, in part because of your patience as a researcher and the amount of time you spent going through those memoirs, which others have looked at occasionally, but not dipped as deeply into as you did in getting a sense of what was going on at different dimensions inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with Chinese diplomats over a long time. And I think the second very powerful and useful part of the book is the account of Zhou Enlai in his different incarnations, and using him as not only the creator and the designer of some of the instincts and ways inside the foreign ministry, but as being in some ways an abiding symbol of the dual nature of charm and assertion when necessary. In Canada, Zhou Enlai is remembered principally because of his interactions with Pierre Trudeau and at the time that Canada opened diplomatic relations, and their conversations, which have been the stuff of legend and of some books, in the interchange as Canada and China set up that relationship in perilous period just after in the midst of the Cultural Revolution. Peter, I wanted to ask you, because the book has received a lot of attention in different countries. We've seen you speaking with a variety of American groups in particular about it. But I want to start by asking you a question directly. How has your book been received in the United States? Have you hit have you hit if not a sensitive nerve, at least reinforced or at least played into some of the current discussions around the strategic competition with China? And I also wanted to ask you at the same time, what has been your response from some of those Chinese diplomats that you knew, that I know, that we have talked to over time? How's the book going over?
Yeah, so well, thank you first of all for the kind comments. I appreciate that, and it means a lot. In terms of reception in the US, I guess as I kind of suggested at the outset, I didn't necessarily think this was going to be an especially useful book for people. I just became captivated by the topic and wanted to pursue it. My kind of starting point was that I was fascinated by the fact that Chinese diplomats had to navigate these two very, very different worlds, the closed, paranoid world of the Communist Party and the kind of rarefied world of international diplomacy. And I thought, what a strange and challenging way to spend your life, trying to walk a tightrope between these two existences. So that was kind of my motivation. And I guess as I was researching it, I realized that it could help to solve a different puzzle as well, which was, on the minds of a lot of officials around the world, but perhaps especially American officials. Why are Chinese diplomats acting like this? What's behind it? And I think the default assumption, partly because China is very good at projecting strength and confidence, the default assumption is that it comes from arrogance on the part of China that goes together with its new power and is related to a perception that the US is in decline, and there's truth to that, but it's really only half of the explanation at best. I think the fact that we've seen these repeated cycles of assertiveness go in and out over time, and that they seem to be linked so closely to times of domestic tension and uncertainty in China, it has a lot to do with it as well. And so I guess it was somewhat useful to people here as they tried to figure out why are Chinese diplomats acting like this, and then also on the minds of American policymakers far more than countries like Britain or Canada perhaps, is this very direct question of what does China want, and can it get it, and will they displace us? I think those of us who don't come from global superpowers don't tend to be as consumed by those questions, but people in the US and especially in Washington really do spend a lot of time thinking about them. So I guess that that's part of the appeal as well, and for that reason, I've been gratified that it's been received pretty well here. On the Chinese side, I don't know is the answer. They're very tight-lipped about these things. I know a couple of people I'm friendly with have ordered copies of it, and I'm aware that they're aware of it. I haven't received any kind of official feedback, and maybe that's just fine.
Well, this won't count as official feedback, but we had some Chinese friends, academics, and a couple of diplomats. Really interesting reactions. No one has thought that you have misrepresented what you called that tightrope, walking between dealing with an international audience and the complexities of, to use the phrase, head office, what is in the background. But I think there's a hint in some of the comments and reactions that you may be too harsh in the book in an implicit prediction that this is the not only the rising tide at the moment, or at least that the wolf warrior style is evidenced in a variety of places, but where it's going to be in future. And you mentioned some of the recognition of the costs of the overt, the blatant, the heavy-handed wolf warrior style. Certain people who have been elevated and have done pretty well because of the way they position themselves on that. But in light of your other comment about cycles on this thing moves. They've hinted that maybe this was the high water mark of something that could be receding, that there are going to be ways to navigate. And I wondered how you felt about that. You've written a pretty interesting book and its predictive capacity, where things are moving, recognizing, as you put it, that there are some pretty suave, sophisticated people inside the Chinese system who can, at the highest levels of any kind of diplomats. But for the moment, their voice is not of the high level, at the commanding heights on this matter, but that might be shifting. What do you think, Peter? Where is it going? Is your book going to be the picture of the high water mark of the wolf, or are we going to, or maybe there's more and even deeper to come?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating to hear the feedback. I think my kind of instincts on hearing that, kind of a few things come to mind. People in China's foreign policy establishment, not just the foreign ministry, but the whole kind of intellectual apparatus that goes alongside it in universities and think tanks in China, as far as I can tell anyway, have tended to be relatively uncomfortable with wolf warrior diplomacy in general. I think there are people who certainly feel that China needed to take on a bolder role in world affairs, and who didn't think that, Deng Xiaoping's approach to hiding and biding was appropriate for a global superpower. And perhaps they're right about that. But there's a lot of disagreement about tactics. And I think there is this widespread sense that wolf warrior diplomacy was unhelpful and counterproductive. And so I suspect there's a degree of kind of hope on the part of those people providing feedback as well, that things will improve and things will change. And maybe they're right. I don't know. I know that there's research going on at the moment at University College Dublin to look into the tweets of Chinese diplomats before and after Xi Jinping's Politburo remarks to the Politburo study session, I think in June, where he called for a more lovable image for the country. So they're looking at, empirically, has there been a shift in the rhetoric that China's using? And I think that will be very interesting. But the fact that it's not especially easy on the surface to tell that there's been a retraction of the assertiveness, I also think kind of speaks volumes. And everything, when you think about the Pew polling across OECD countries, you think about how unhappy not just elites in the West, but India, countries across the world are with Chinese behavior. You'd think that there were major incentives for recalibration, and that just doesn't seem to have happened. And I guess the kind of two things come into play. One are the personal preferences of Xi Jinping, who seems to be relatively comfortable with this kind of assertive approach. The second is perceptions in Beijing of US decline and of Western decline, which I think might go some way to explaining why China hasn't shifted its this kind of counterproductive approach to diplomacy. And the Biden administration officials, including Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific coordinator, talk quite explicitly about their desire to dissuade Chinese elites of this notion that the US is in kind of terminal decline. And I think probably the verdict in Beijing is not back yet in terms of whether they've succeeded. If they don't succeed, then I think we can expect wolf warrior diplomacy to kind of continue full steam. And if they do, perhaps President Xi will feel compelled to recalibrate.
It's so well written. And there are turns of phrase that are quotable. I put a number of them on my wall. And one of them that struck me was the following sentence: arrogant but brittle, entitled but insecure. Chinese diplomats are in many ways a microcosm of the kind of power China is set to become. So in that sentence, there's a suggestion that your bet is that, as you've characterized it, the Xi Jinping approach on these matters is going to be in place for a fair amount of time and is going to demand particular kinds of international responses. That's the underpinning to this. Am I reading you right, that you think this is the China we should be ready to live with, or at least manage, or try to constrain going forward?
Well, I mean, I guess my take on wolf warrior diplomacy, and here maybe I depart a little bit from some of the kind of general commentary on the topic. People tend to talk about the wolf warriors as if they're a cohesive group of people who have a fixed set of preferences for how China should conduct itself in the world. So there are wolf warriors in the Chinese system in the same way that there were neocons in the US system in the lead up to the Iraq War. I don't really think of it like that. I think of kind of wolf warrior diplomacy as a set of tactics which are available to all Chinese diplomats at all times, and sometimes they're used more than others. Even figures who we think of as kind of very much on that suave, open, cosmopolitan side of the spectrum, people like former Chinese ambassador to the US, Cui Tiankai. Cui is capable of going red in the face, shouting at US counterparts. If you read accounts of him negotiating with Kurt Campbell over the release of Chen Guangcheng, a blind Chinese lawyer who was housed in the US embassy for a little while, he took that approach. And I've heard from other diplomats of him being very theatrical in his anger, and yet Cui is by no means an advocate of that type of diplomacy. So I tend to think that even among the least wolfish of Chinese diplomats, and even at time, if you think of asking a Chinese official a question about Taiwan in the 1990s when China was mid-charm offensive, you would also have got back a pretty kind of steamy response from them, because they have never been relaxed about that topic, and they've always felt the need to kind of show off their patriotism. And so I tend to think that even in those charm offensive periods, Chinese diplomats and Chinese officials can come across as quite insecure and quite brittle at the same time as wanting to have this swagger about China in the world. I guess it's a matter of degree. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying, even if China recalibrates, I think that most of that sentence would still stand up to scrutiny.
Very subtle, most of that sentence. That's a great way of putting it. This is fascinating, and I will end with this observation and question embedded in it. Is sometimes there's a danger in singularizing China, because many of the aspects of performative diplomacy that you speak about, I can say with some confidence that Canadians have run into American officials who have occasionally raised their voices, have taken, though they're a little more subtle the way they might put it to the press. It's some of those characteristics play out in superpowers, great powers in general. But I wanted to twist it in the direction, and I'm not encouraging you to give up your current position. We need you working with Bloomberg. But the question is, imagine it was a world where you were hired by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to give them advice on how they should reposition their diplomats to go forward. Now, it may be that it's mission impossible and you would reject it out of hand. But is there a little advice that you might hope to see in a China that would be more fox-like and less wolf-like in its approach?
Gosh, that is, I completely agree with you on the point of of making treating China as too unique a target. And I talked about the lead up to the Iraq War earlier, but certainly that was a group of, in many cases, highly intellectual US officials on the foreign policy side of the house, who were also capable of being pretty testy with their foreign counterparts. And I do think that with great power and strength often comes a kind of arrogant approach, or actions which can be perceived to the outside world, at least, as very arrogant. And that's not something that's unique to China. It's actually something that kind of frustrates me a little bit when people talk about the Middle Kingdom syndrome in Beijing or whatever. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe that's true, but I think that's probably true of all powerful countries. If you ask Nepalese elites what they think of Delhi's behavior, they'll give a description which sounds quite a lot like how some people might have characterized the Trump administration, or how people characterize Xi Jinping's China. So I absolutely take that point. In terms of advising the Chinese Foreign Ministry, I think that sounds like possibly the most stressful job I can imagine. I mean, I think it might be harder to work in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, but apart from that, in the Chinese Foreign Ministry would be really tough. I mean, I think that from there, if I put myself in their shoes, it's their job to be responsive to the tone set by the Communist Party, and there's nothing they can do about that. And if Xi Jinping wants a more assertive tone for China, then they need to follow that lead. And if people don't like that, they need to take up the conversation with Xi Jinping. What I suppose that they do have some control over is how quickly the rhetoric goes from a 5 to a 10. And I think that there are real costs to immediately escalating the kind of performative anger to a 10. There are obvious costs in terms of reputation that we've discussed, but there are actually really serious costs for Chinese and for global security as well, because it's when it comes to assessing PRC intentions in the world, we don't have very many good avenues for assessing the way that assessing what China wants. One of them is listening to the speeches of its leaders, but that's problematic because the speeches are tailored for their audiences, and they're also often highly abstract and difficult even for Chinese audiences to interpret. Another one is official media, which has quite a similar set of problems. And then there are Chinese officials and Chinese diplomats. And in the past, if you look at the literature which exists on North Korea's nuclear program, outside, foreign academics were able to pass the language of the foreign ministry very, very carefully. And they would say, oh, they've used this word to express their anger this time. And so that means the Chinese government must be really angry. And the outside world kind of knew how to interpret that. And that is quite a subtle messaging system. It's not easy to understand, but it's something that the outside world was able to get its head around. Now, angry adjectives from the Chinese foreign ministry are being pumped out on a constant basis, and we tend to focus on the reputation hit that gives China, but there's a signaling hit, an interpretation hit there, which kind of makes the world a slightly more dangerous place. And I guess that would be my advice to them.
You're hired. Back to you, Kristen.
Great, thanks, Paul, for a fantastic set of questions. A reminder to our audience members, please feel free to pose any questions you have through the Q&A function. I may take advantage of my position as moderator to pose a couple of questions to Peter. One of my questions follows on Paul's last point. When you were describing China's wolf warrior diplomacy, the offensive tweets, extreme nationalism, aggressive posturing, this all sounded very much like Trump's brand of Twitter diplomacy. Which proved, very popular with a large part of the domestic audience in the US. And so, first of all, to what extent is China's wolf warrior diplomacy similar or different from Trump's brand of diplomacy? And second, to what extent were the wolf warriors sort of taking a page from Trump's book? Did Trump having, this prominent national leader on the world stage, behaving the way that he did it sort of push or change the boundaries of what constituted acceptable behavior in the realm of diplomacy or by public figures? So did Trump fundamentally change the game and sort of open up the space for this type of wolf warrior diplomacy? Another question I had was, as you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks, Trump in many ways was a gift to China. The way in which he alienated and antagonized, all of the US's major allies, countries around the world, left and right. This seemed like a perfect opportunity for China to try to step in and fill that gap, to assume a greater leadership role. This, was a prime opportunity for China to win friends and gain influence simply by not being Trump and behaving in that aggressive, antagonistic way. And yet we saw exactly the opposite occur. China similarly behaving very aggressively and alienated and antagonizing many countries as well. So this seems like this extraordinary misstep from the top down in China. So what drove this? Why or how do we explain how China managed to botch this so badly? And
sorry.
One more question I have in the conclusion of your book. You have this extraordinarily striking vignette, this little story that you tell about your conversation with a young Chinese diplomat who asked you whether Tiananmen was an American plot. And this was, a striking, searing image. So I wanted to ask you, based on that, many are concerned today about growing tensions between the US and China. There's a sense that, the best way to try to diffuse some of these tensions, avoid a conflict, is through person-to-person ties between countries. Given what you've said about, in that story and others in the book, what's actually to be done here? What possibilities are for building bridges with people in China when they're fed these lies by their own government that many people, even very well-educated people, its own diplomats, believe? When the Chinese government has such extraordinary ideological power, such power over people's information and beliefs, how do you try to form those person-to-person ties to diffuse this potential for conflict between countries in that context?
Yeah, great questions, and very, very wide ranging. So if I lose the track of what I'm saying, you'll have to bring me back onto the right path. In terms of the comparison with Trump, I think that it's an important one, actually, in a few different ways. In terms of the way that things were similar and different, there were real similarities in terms of tactics and actually cases of pretty clear emulation on the part of the Chinese foreign ministry. The spokeswoman Hua Chunying's Twitter account is full, I think still now, even of all caps sections in her tweets. And there's one leading practitioner of all caps tweets, and that's former President Trump. And so, there was certainly a degree of emulation. I also think that the Trump administration kind of wolf warrior diplomacy existed before Trump, but that some of the most extreme outbursts from Chinese diplomats were prompted by a strong desire to protect the system from what they saw as the onslaught of the Trump administration. And I think China's response to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is the best example of that. I sat in foreign ministry briefings where, we would ask on a daily basis, President Trump said this, whatever, very provocative thing about China, whatever it was that day. Does the foreign ministry have any comment? And they would say, we condemn US bullying and China will stand up for ourselves. But if they were pressed to ask to speak about Trump, they would talk about his friendship with President Xi, or they would avoid the topic altogether. If we did the same thing about Pompeo, the response would be well prepared in advance, and it would be angry and vitriolic, and they would just go in for these incredibly personal attacks on him. And I think the reason that they did that, which is a very strange thing to do, given that he is his State Department was the primary US interlocutor of the foreign ministry. And the reason they did that was because Pompeo constantly questioned the ruling legitimacy of the Communist Party. And that for them is the reddest of red lines, and they went for it. So there was this kind of interaction between Trump's diplomacy and wolf warrior diplomacy in China, and they kind of fed off each other and exacerbated each other a little bit. And in that sense, I do think that Trump kind of pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in a way that was interpreted by Chinese elites in quite a counterproductive way. I remember having conversations with people and saying, your approach to diplomacy seems to be really upsetting people around the world. And they'd say, well, look at what President Trump says. And it's like, well, yeah, that's true. But does that mean that that's an example to follow? That also seems to not be going down very well in the countries it's aimed at. So I guess it did shift the boundaries, and probably in a way that wasn't interpreted perfectly in Beijing. In terms of China getting its approach so wrong, I think some of that was already in motion before Trump ever came on the scene. I sort of talked about how this assertiveness started in 2008 and built gradually over time with Xi and then Trump and then the virus. And so in a sense, I kind of see that very brief window where Xi Jinping spoke at Davos, and the world kind of talked about this big opening for China. As it's true that there was an opening there, but I kind of think that the big ship of Chinese government was already sailing in the wrong direction before that. And even if you think of the months surrounding that Davos speech, it was, I think, January 2017. There was a major crackdown going on civil society groups. Academics were being arrested in Beijing. China's military was upsetting people. China's industrial policy was angering foreign companies, and all of these things which have contributed to the backlash were continuing despite the very successful speech at Davos. And so I guess partly Beijing overstated the extent to which Trump gave them freedom to maneuver, and overstated the extent of US weakness and decline, and partly they just carried on the path they were already on, which was kind of counterproductive. On the last point, when it comes to person-to-person diplomacy, I think it's a really challenging question for kind of anyone who wants to engage more closely with China. As you say, it's always been difficult. It's become more difficult it's always been difficult, but it's always been really, really important. And it's become much more difficult under Xi. Control over universities, NGOs, all of the institutions which might have been interlocutors on the Chinese side have become much more tightly controlled by the Communist Party, either directly or kind of indirectly. And so China's vision of people-to-people diplomacy is really your people and our government, or quasi-government having a dialogue, and that's really tough. And COVID has made it even tougher, because oftentimes, when you think of track 2 dialogues or academics discussing the way that China works with their counterparts in Beijing, the most useful moments were those little asides at the coffee table, outside the bathroom or whatever, when you're chatting and you don't have your colleagues all looking at you, and you can have those little interactions where you're frank about your point of view and they feel safe in putting forward their real opinion as well. And COVID has shut that down because everything is virtual and everything is being watched and monitored. And so I think that was one of the kind of few safety valves where there was kind of a wink and a nudge where Chinese officials could diffuse some of the frustration with Beijing's official policies, and that is really not there. And I guess, I mean, I don't know how you solve that. I guess my only answer is kind of stick with it, because I don't see how you can plausibly have a policy which involves not talking to 1 in 6 humans. Just doesn't seem tenable to me. I guess I'll leave my answers there because I've gone on long enough.
Great. We have a couple of questions from our audience. I'll read these out. So one is following in part from our earlier discussion a moment ago. The question is, to what degree is the current wolf warrior diplomacy exacerbated by the vacuum in international forums left by the US and UK in the mid-2010s? Does that signal a different type of current wolf warrior diplomacy? And second question, do you think that China, having historically been a unified body, affects how its diplomats interact with the rest of the world, compared to the Western experience, where diplomacy was a super necessary part of state survival in a historically divided Europe and the world wars, and again during the Cold War?
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat the second question again?
Question is, do you think that China, having historically been a unified body, affects how its diplomats interact with the rest of the world, compared to the Western experience, where diplomacy was a super necessary part of state survival in a historically divided Europe and the world wars, and again during the Cold War?
Yeah, really smart questions. Yeah, I do think that the kind of step back from leadership roles in international institutions exacerbated wolf warrior diplomacy, partly because it fed into a broader narrative in China that the West was in decline, and that China's moment had come. And then kind of on a more specific level, because Chinese officials saw an opportunity to promote things like the United Nations, to put phrases into UN resolutions that had little snippets of Xi's speeches and those kinds of things. So there was kind of a domestic incentive to do that too, and Trump and Brexit and those kind of things fed into that. In terms of China being a unified body historically, I guess I mean, I don't know. It's super interesting to kind of ponder it. My initial thought is that the system of diplomacy that came out of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, with these unified foreign ministries that fed into this Westphalian system of states, was highly unusual and wasn't typical of anywhere else in the world, but was then exported and it went global, and it's become synonymous with what we now think of as modern diplomacy. And so that was kind of a rude awakening for many countries around the world, and maybe it was an especially rude awakening for Imperial China, which had never had one body which dealt with outside countries before. External relations had kind of been dealt with on an ad hoc basis by different government ministries, depending on the status and the role that those relationships played with Beijing. And so in the 19th and early 20th century, certainly that was a very, very startling thing for China. I guess I would be slightly skeptical in thinking, in reading too much into how that impacts current events now, because I think if any country in the world has kind of internalized like Westphalian notions of sovereignty and the implicit assumptions of that system, with great zeal and enthusiasm, it's Beijing. And oftentimes now China finds itself as the strongest advocate of a kind of state-centric, sovereignty-centric approach to international relations, when other countries want to talk about universal rights and values and those kinds of things. So my gut instinct is that it was super important. It's not so important now, but I'm very open to other interpretations.
Great. So I'm afraid we're at the end of our time, but I want to thank Peter and Paul for a fascinating discussion, and thanks to our audience members as well. So thanks again, everyone, and wish you a good afternoon.